The invitation came in the mail, an actual paper invitation, thick cardstock with gold foil edges, the kind of thing my mother spent weeks picking out and then complained about the cost of. I remember holding it in my kitchen in Boston and laughing because of course she'd sent me a formal invitation to my own brother's rehearsal dinner. We hadn't spoken in 3 months. The last conversation ended with her telling me I was becoming difficult to love. I'd hung up and cried in my car for an hour. Then I went back to work and closed a 6-figure deal that afternoon. My name is Vivian Marchetti. I'm 31 years old and I'm a senior architect at a firm in the Back Bay. I design private residences for people who think nothing of dropping $4 million on a summer house in Nantucket. I've been doing this since I was 24. I am, by every measure that matters in the world outside my family, successful. Inside my family, I have always been the disappointment. My brother Damon is the success. My brother Damon, who is 28, who has been between opportunities for the last 4 years, who got engaged 6 months ago to a woman named Callista, whose father owns a chain of car dealerships in Connecticut. The wedding was in Newport. Of course it was in Newport. My mother had been telling everyone at her church for months that Damon was marrying into the Talbot family, which apparently meant something to people who cared about that sort of thing. I did not care, but I went, because that's what you do, and because despite everything, I still believed on some idiot level that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I'd show up and my mother would look at me and see her daughter instead of a problem. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being the family ATM. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in degrees so small you don't notice them. When I was 24 and got my first real paycheck, I paid my dad's car insurance because his had lapsed and he couldn't drive to work. He was supposed to pay me back. He never did. When I was 26, I co-signed on my parents' refinance because their credit was wrecked and they were going to lose the house in Quincy. When I was 28, I started covering the property taxes just for 1 quarter. That quarter became every quarter. By the time I was 30, I was paying their mortgage entirely, their utilities, their property taxes, my brother's car payment, my brother's phone bill, and a small contribution to my brother's business venture, which was, as far as I could tell, him sitting in coffee shops with a laptop he didn't open. A house in Quincy. I should tell you about the house in Quincy. 2 years ago, my parents told me they were going to lose it. The bank was foreclosing. My mother cried on the phone for 45 minutes. My father, who had never asked me for anything directly in his life, got on the line and said, in the smallest voice I'd ever heard from him, that he didn't know what to do. So I bought it. I bought my parents' house out of foreclosure for $380,000. I put it in my name because my lawyer told me to, and because honestly, by that point I knew. I knew on some level that I was paying for something I'd never get back. I let them keep living there. I didn't charge them rent. I told them it was their home. Just on paper, it was mine. My mother told everyone she knew that they'd worked out a refinance. She told the women at her church that they had paid off the mortgage. She told her sister, my Aunt Genevieve, that they had come into some money. She did not tell anyone, ever, that her daughter had bought her house, because that would have meant acknowledging that her daughter existed in a way she could not bear to acknowledge. So, the wedding. Newport. June. I drove down from Boston in a navy silk dress I'd bought at Bergdorf, because my mother had told me, in a text message, that the bride doesn't want any drama and you know how you are. I'd taken that to mean, dress conservatively, don't outshine, don't make this about you. Fine, I could do that. I wore navy. I wore the pearls my grandmother left me. I wore flat shoes because the ceremony was on a lawn and I didn't want to sink into the grass like an idiot. I brought a gift, a Tiffany frame, because Callista had registered for one, and a card with a check for $10,000 inside it, $10,000, to a brother who had not held a job in 4 years. I arrived at the venue at 4. The ceremony was at 5. I went looking for my mother to say hello, to do the thing, and I found her in the bridal suite fussing with Callista's veil. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did this small thing, this tiny flicker, like she'd hoped I wouldn't show up. Then she smiled the smile she uses for company. "Vivian, you made it." Like I was a distant cousin. Like she hadn't given birth to me. Callista didn't turn around. Callista, who I'd met exactly twice, said into the mirror, "Oh, hi." Just like that. "Oh, hi." I'd flown out to Connecticut for her engagement party. I'd sent her a Le Creuset Dutch oven for her bridal shower. "Oh, hi." I said congratulations. I said it was a beautiful day. My mother told me, in the same fake warm voice, that I should find my seat at the ceremony. Find your seat. Like I was a guest at a stranger's wedding. I went outside. I found a chair toward the back. The ceremony was fine. My brother looked nervous and a little drunk. Callista cried at the appropriate moments. I clapped when everyone clapped. My mother did not look at me once during the entire ceremony, even though I was sitting in her direct line of sight. The reception was in the main building, a converted mansion right on the water. Cocktail hour was on the terrace. I got a glass of champagne and stood near the railing and tried to look like a person who was having a nice time. My Aunt Genevieve came over and hugged me and said I looked beautiful and asked how work was going. She was the only person in my family who ever asked how work was going. I told her I'd just signed a contract for a house in Aspen. She squeezed my hand and said, "Your mother must be so proud." I didn't have the heart to tell her that my mother had no idea what I did for a living. My mother thought I worked in offices. She told people I was an office girl when she remembered to mention me at all. Then we went in for dinner. And that's where it started. The seating chart was on an easel by the door. Beautiful calligraphy. I scanned for my name, table 12. I walked through the room toward table 12 and saw immediately what it was. Table 12 was the children's table. It was tucked behind a column away from the main floor, set with paper placemats and plastic cups. There were 6 kids at it already, ranging from maybe 4 years old to 11, and 1 empty seat, with my name on it, Vivian. In the same calligraphy as the rest. I stood there for a second. Just stood there. I could feel my face getting hot. I turned around and walked back to the main floor and found my mother at table 2, the parents' table, the table closest to the dance floor and the wedding party. I leaned down next to her and I said quietly, "Mom, there's been a mistake with my seating." She didn't look up. She was buttering a roll. She said, "There's no mistake, honey." I said, "I'm at the kids' table." She said, still not looking up, "Callista's family is very large. We had to make accommodations. Your family, you understand." I said, "You sat me at the children's table." And then my father, who had been pretending not to hear, set down his glass and said, loud enough for the people around us to hear, "Vivian, don't make this about you. Not today. Not on your brother's day. It's just a chair. Sit down. Don't be selfish." I want to tell you what that felt like, but I'm not sure I can. I want to tell you what it felt like to be 31 years old in a navy silk dress with $10,000 in my purse, having paid for the house my father slept in last night, and to be told by that same father, in front of 40 strangers, that I was being selfish for asking why I had been seated with the children. A woman at the next table looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. The kind of pity that is also embarrassment. The kind that makes you wish the floor would open. I straightened up. I didn't say anything else. I walked back to table 12. I sat down between an 8-year-old with chocolate already on her chin and a boy of maybe 6 who was drawing on his placemat with a crayon. The boy looked up at me and said, "Are you a kid?" I said, "Apparently." He laughed. He had no idea what was happening. He just thought it was funny that a grown-up was sitting at his table. I asked him what he was drawing. He said a dinosaur. He showed me. It was a good dinosaur. I told him so. He was very pleased. Dinner was served. Salad. I ate it from a plastic plate. The kids around me drank apple juice. There was no wine at the children's table. Of course there wasn't. I drank my water. I watched my mother across the room laughing at something Callista's father said. I watched my brother stand up and give a speech about how Callista was the best thing that ever happened to him, and how grateful he was to his parents for always believing in him. He did not mention me. He looked at me exactly once when his eyes swept the room and his face did this small thing, the same thing my mother's had done, and then he looked away. The 8-year-old next to me, the one with the chocolate on her chin, asked me if I wanted to color. She had a little pack of crayons. I said yes. I colored a picture of a unicorn with her. She told me her name was Madeline. She told me she liked my pearls. She told me, very seriously, that her mom said she could have pearls when she was 16. I told her that sounded like a fair deal. We talked about her cat. The cat's name was Pickle. Pickle had recently learned to open the kitchen cabinet. Madeline was concerned about this development. Somewhere between the salad and the entree, I made a decision. I excused myself. I went to the ladies' room. I locked myself in a stall, and I sat on the closed toilet seat in my $800 dress, and I took out my phone. I opened my email. I scrolled until I found the message from my lawyer, Aldous, from when we'd closed on the Quincy house. The deed was attached as a PDF. I downloaded it. I opened my banking app. I looked at the auto pays I had set up. The mortgage on my parents' second car, which I'd refinanced last year. The utilities at the Quincy house. My brother's phone. My brother's car insurance. The small monthly contribution to my brother's business, which was just $500 going into his Venmo on the first of every month. I started canceling things. I canceled my brother's car insurance first, then his phone, then the auto pay for the Venmo. Then I went into my banking app and stopped the standing transfers to my parents' joint account. They were getting $1,800 a month from me. $1,800 a month on top of everything else. I'd been doing it for so long I'd stopped noticing it. I stopped it. I stopped all of it. Then I forwarded the deed to a printing service in Newport, and I paid the rush fee to have it printed and delivered to the venue within the hour. I tipped extra. I went back out. I sat down at the children's table. I colored another unicorn with Madeline. I asked the 6-year-old about his dinosaur again. The entree came. Some kind of chicken. I ate it from a plastic plate. Madeline asked me why my hands were shaking. I told her I was just a little cold. She offered me her sweater. Very seriously. It was a child's cardigan with butterflies on it. She really would have given it to me. I thanked her and told her I'd warm up soon. I almost cried at the kids' table over an 8-year-old's butterfly cardigan. I did not cry. I held it in. The printing service called my phone. I excused myself again and went to the valet stand, and a young man in a uniform handed me a manila envelope. I tipped him $20. He looked surprised. I went back inside. The toast had started. Callista's father stood up first. He talked about his daughter for 10 minutes. He talked about how proud he was. He talked about how Damon was joining a family that takes care of its own. That phrase, takes care of its own. I almost laughed out loud at the kids' table. Then my father stood up. My father, who hadn't worked a steady job in 6 years, who lived in a house I owned, who had eaten dinner with money I sent, stood up in his rented tuxedo and raised a glass of champagne I had effectively paid for and started a speech. He talked about Damon, about what a good boy Damon had always been, about how Damon was the kind of son every father dreams of. He said Damon had always known what was important, family. He said Damon had never let them down. He talked for 6 minutes about Damon. He did not say my name. He did not gesture in my direction. He did not acknowledge that he had another child sitting at the children's table 40 feet away. When he was done, he raised his glass and said, "To my son, to Damon, to family that shows up when it matters." People clapped. People drank. I stood up. I want to tell you that I planned what happened next. I want to tell you that I had a speech ready. I didn't. I just stood up because I couldn't sit at the kids' table for one more second. Madeline looked up at me with her crayon paused in the air, and I patted her shoulder. I walked across the dining room. People watched me. I think they thought I was going to the bathroom again. I walked up to the main table, the parents' table, where my mother was dabbing her eyes with a napkin from my father's speech. I tapped my champagne glass with my butter knife. The room went quiet. I smiled. I made sure I smiled because I had read once that the most powerful thing you can do when you're about to ruin someone's life is to smile while you do it. I smiled at my father. I smiled at my mother. I smiled at my brother, who had gone very pale. I said, "I'd like to make a toast too." My mother's mouth opened. She started to say my name, the morning version of my name, the one she'd used since I was 7. Vivian. I didn't let her finish. I said, "I'm Vivian, Damon's older sister. Some of you have met me. Most of you haven't because I've been seated at the children's table this evening. My mother says it's because Callista's family is very large. My father says it's because I'm being selfish. So I want to thank the bride and groom for the unique opportunity to color a unicorn with an 8-year-old named Madeline. Madeline, if you're listening, your unicorn was the better one." A few people laughed. Nervously. The kind of laughter you do when you're not sure if you're allowed. I said, "I also want to take this moment to make a small correction to my father's beautiful speech. My father said his son has never let him down. I'm sure that's true. My father didn't mention his daughter at all. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a senior architect. I design houses. Big ones. The kind of houses you see in magazines." I looked at my mother. She had gone the color of paper. I said, 2 years ago, I bought my parents' house in Quincy out of foreclosure. I paid $380,000 for it. I have not charged them rent. I have paid their utilities, their property taxes, and their homeowner's insurance every month for the last 24 months. I have also paid my brother's car insurance, his phone bill, his car payment, and a monthly contribution to his Venmo because he is 28 years old and has not been gainfully employed since 2021. The room was completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped moving. I held up the manila envelope. I said, "This is the deed to the house in Quincy, my parents' house. The house my father slept in last night before driving down here in the car I make the payments on. It has my name on it, Vivian Marchetti, sole owner." I looked at my father. My father, who had told me I was being selfish, was staring at his hands. I said, "Dad, you told me earlier that it was just a chair. You told me not to be selfish. So I want to give you the same gift you gave me tonight. I want you to know that it's just a house. It's just a car. It's just a phone. It's just $1,800 a month. They're just things. You can stand without them. Don't be dramatic." I set the envelope on the table in front of my mother. I said, "You have 90 days to find somewhere else to live. My attorney will be in touch on Monday. Damon, congratulations on your wedding. Callista, welcome to the family. I hope you understand what you've married into." I picked up my champagne glass, the glass I had been given when I arrived before I was banished to the kids' table. I said, "To family that shows up when it matters." I drank. I set the glass down. I walked out. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. I want to tell you that I floated out of that mansion on a cloud of righteous fury. I didn't. I made it to my car and I sat in the driver's seat and I shook for 20 minutes. I shook so hard I couldn't put the key in the ignition. I called my best friend Soraya, who had told me 3 years ago to stop paying my parents' bills, who had been telling me for years that they were going to destroy me if I let them. I called her and I cried so hard I couldn't speak for a full minute. She waited. She said, "Take your time, babe. I'm here." When I could finally talk, I told her what I'd done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you driving home tonight?" I said, "Yes." She said, "No, you're not. You're driving to my place. I'm 40 minutes away. I'm pouring you a drink right now." I drove to Soraya's. She lives in Providence in a brownstone she renovated herself. She met me at the door in pajamas. She had a glass of wine in each hand. She hugged me and I cried into her shoulder. And she didn't say a single "I told you so." She just let me cry. Then she put on a movie I'd already seen 100 times, and we sat on her couch, and she didn't ask me about it, and I didn't talk about it, and at some point I fell asleep and woke up the next morning covered in a blanket she'd put over me. My phone had 47 missed calls. I didn't return any of them. Aldous, my attorney, called me Monday morning. I'd already emailed him Sunday night with everything I'd done. He's a man in his late 60s who has been my lawyer since I bought my first apartment at 26. He was, I had come to learn over the years, the only adult in my life who consistently told me the truth. He said on the phone Monday, "Vivienne, I have been waiting 6 years for this call. We're going to do this right." He drafted the eviction notice himself. He served it himself, driving down to Quincy on Tuesday. He sent me a photo afterward. My mother had answered the door. She had screamed at him. He'd handed her the papers anyway. He told me later, in his dry, old lawyer voice, that he found the whole thing rather invigorating. My mother called me 93 times in the first week. My father called 11. My brother did not call at all, but he sent a series of escalating text messages that ended with the phrase, "You've ruined my life." I read it standing in line at a coffee shop in Cambridge, and I laughed out loud. The barista asked if I was okay. I said I'd just gotten some really good news. My Aunt Genevieve called me on a Thursday. I picked up. I picked up because she was the only person in my family who had ever asked how my work was going. She said, "Vivienne, honey, I heard what happened." I waited. I expected the speech. The blood is thicker. The family is family. The "you need to forgive" speech. Instead, my Aunt Genevieve said, "I wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you. I've been wanting to tell you that for years, and I was a coward about it. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner." I cried in my car for the second time in a month, but this time it was a different kind of crying. My parents found somewhere to live. They moved into my Aunt Cordelia's spare room in Worcester. Aunt Cordelia, who has always had opinions about everyone, told my mother she could stay for 3 months, and then she had to figure something out. My mother lasted 6 weeks before Cordelia kicked her out for being exhausting. My parents ended up renting a small apartment in Brockton with money I will never know the source of. My brother and Callista moved in with Callista's parents in Connecticut. Callista's father, I heard later through Aunt Genevieve, was furious. Apparently the Talbots had been under the impression that Damon was a young professional starting his career, which was technically true, in the sense that he had been starting his career for 4 years and would continue to start it forever. I sold the house in Quincy in November. I'd had it appraised. It had appreciated significantly. I cleared $110,000 on the sale. I put $80,000 into my retirement and used the rest to take a trip to Italy by myself. I'd never been to Italy. I went for 3 weeks. I ate pasta in Rome. I drank wine in Florence. I stood in front of paintings I'd only seen in textbooks, and I cried in front of one of them, a small Caravaggio in a side chapel in a church I can't even remember the name of. I cried because I was 31 years old, and I had never done anything just for myself before. Everything I'd done up until that summer had been for other people. The trip to Italy was the first thing I'd ever done that was just mine. I came back. I went back to work. I got promoted to principal in February. I am now the youngest principal in the history of my firm. I bought myself a condo in the South End, a real one, with my own money, not in my parents' name, not under any obligation to anyone. I adopted a cat. His name is Pellegrino. He is a menace, and I love him. I have not spoken to my parents in 14 months. I have not spoken to my brother in 14 months. I'm not sure I ever will again. I used to think that would feel like a tragedy. It doesn't. It feels like a window opening in a room I didn't know was airless. Last week I had dinner with Aunt Genevieve. She drove up to Boston. We went to a little place near my office. She told me she'd seen my mother at the grocery store recently. She said my mother had asked about me. She said my mother had said, "I just want her to come home." Aunt Genevieve had looked her in the eye and said, "She is home, Estelle. You just don't live there." I think about that all the time. I am home. They just don't live there. Madeline, the 8-year-old, sent me a Christmas card. Her mother had gotten my address somehow, probably from the wedding planner. The card had a unicorn on it. Madeline had drawn it herself. Inside, she had written in careful 8-year-old handwriting, "Dear Vivian, I hope you have a good Christmas. Pickle says hi. From Madeline." I framed the card. It hangs in my kitchen. It is the only thing in my home that came from that wedding, and it is the only thing I will ever keep. I've thought about that night at Newport more times than I can count. Not the way you'd expect, though. I don't replay the toast or my father's face going gray, or the silence in that dining room when I set the manila envelope down. What I come back to, over and over, is the moment before. The moment I sat at the children's table with chocolate-chinned Madeline and decided I was done. Because that's where everything actually changed. Not when I stood up. When I sat down and finally stopped pretending. For 7 years, I told myself that paying my parents' bills was a kindness, that covering Damon's car insurance was what a good sister did, that buying the house in Quincy was what a daughter who had it together was supposed to do for parents who didn't. I dressed it up in pretty words. Loyalty, family, sacrifice. But none of those were the real word. The real word was fear. I was afraid that if I stopped giving, they would stop loving me. So I gave, and they took, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that you cannot buy love from people who have decided you don't deserve it. Here's what I've learned, and I share it not because I think I'm wise, but because I wasted so many years not knowing it. Cause and effect is a law that does not care about your hopes. If you teach people that you have no bottom, they will keep digging. If you reward contempt with generosity, you will get more contempt. My parents did not learn to value me because I bought their house. They learned that my value was the house. That was the lesson my generosity taught them. And they learned it perfectly. There's a difference between being kind and being available for harvest. I confused the two for nearly a decade. Real kindness has a spine in it. Real kindness says, "I love you, and I will also tell you the truth." Real kindness can say no without apologizing for the no. What I had been doing was not kindness. It was a slow, polite kind of self-destruction, and I had been calling it virtue. Strength is not what you think it is either. Strength is not the loud part. Strength is not the toast at the wedding. Strength was the 20 minutes I sat shaking in my car afterward and didn't drive back in and apologize. Strength was every morning since when I woke up and didn't pick up the phone. Strength is the slow, quiet, daily refusal to undo what you know was right even when missing them feels like a sickness. Madeline's Christmas card still hangs in my kitchen. Sometimes I look at it and I think about how a stranger's child gave me her sweater that night because I looked cold, and my own family gave me a plastic plate behind a column. I no longer wonder why. I just know. And knowing, finally, is the freest thing I have ever felt. You are allowed to walk away from people who treat you like an ATM, even if those people share your last name. Especially then.